Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here and joining us. We are delighted today to have Ashley Wagner, who's an occupational therapist at Family Forward in St. Louis, here to talk to our child trauma speaker series about some needs and questions that have come up about referrals and supporting children and youth. So we hope you are looking forward to joining us today. Just as a few kind of etiquette things, we do appreciate if you are able to turn on your camera. It helps create a more collegial environment. Thank you to those that have yourself muted. Um, I think that Tinley and I will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, you can use the chat. Or if it's okay, Ashley, if people unmute and ask questions along the way.
Sure.
She's nodding. And so if you need anything else, feel free to send myself or Temley a message on the back end. And with that, I will turn things over to Ashley, who probably has a better introduction about her expertise than I do. Thank you.
All right, we're just going to dive in. Thank you for kind of holding space for all of that this morning, Amy. I appreciate it. About 10 years ago, I was an early childhood special education evaluator for occupational therapy at a local school district. And I wish that more people in my world, and myself included, would have asked this question more often. Is it sensory related? In fact, during my time as an evaluator, I actually had a foster family that was referred to me. And they came to me with their 3 to 4 year old foster son who had been expelled from 2 preschools by the time he came to me. And as I was doing my evaluation, I asked all the appropriate occupational therapy questions. And I was assured repeatedly that it wasn't sensory, it was behavior. And I want to just own the fact that as an occupational therapist doing that evaluation, I actually failed the child in that moment because I didn't push back on that and I didn't educate because I didn't know. At that time, I had all my occupational therapy training, but I didn't have an understanding of trauma and I didn't understand the overlap between sensory regulation and emotional regulation. I didn't understand that the fact that this child no longer participated in circle time because he couldn't sit still for it long enough was a sensory thing, not a behavior opposition thing. I didn't understand that the fact that he got in fights in line coming in from recess every day was related to his ability to feel safe when being bumped and jostled by other kids, as opposed to being defiant and aggressive. At the time that I was doing these evaluations, I actually became a foster parent myself. And my wife and I were foster parents for 4 years. And it's during that time and that experience that I started to understand the impact that sensory had on all of those behaviors that were happening in my house. And I started to see that a lot of the things that the kids were doing that were annoying, that were stressful for me as a caregiver, were actually expressions of their sensory processing and their trying to figure out the world in which they were living and the sensory world that they were experiencing. I did a lot of self study on this, and I did a lot of training in professions like counseling, social work, before I started to find out that occupational therapy was just an emerging practice in this area, despite the fact that we had such relevant knowledge kind of hoarded away in our profession, and that there were therapists out there and people working with kids and caseworkers that were desperate for this information. And so, through a lot of education and some additional training, including phase 1 of the neurosequential model of therapeutics and the ARC model, I eventually found myself with sensory and trauma as my specialty in my career. And it's something that I continue to use every day in my own home with my 3 adopted children. And it's something that I am very excited to speak with you today. 2 years ago, I actually joined Family Forward's Developmental Trauma Center as the director and creator of their occupational therapy program. And one of my absolute favorite things about my job is that I actually get to collaborate with many amazing professionals who are asking this question every day. Is it sensory related? And so today I am going to walk you through everything that I think will empower you to answer this question and to know where to go to find that answer if it is beyond the realm of your comfort for addressing. So I'm excited to talk with you today. In order to achieve this, what we're going to do is we're going to actually speak through a little intro of what is sensory processing, and then we're going to talk a bit about what the overlap is between sensory and trauma. And then finally, we're going to get into addressing sensory needs with some trauma awareness. If we get to the end of today's discussion and you still have questions, please feel free to email me. I genuinely love talking about this and helping people to problem solve. And so you're welcome to send me questions or connect with me if you want help problem solving or talking through your thoughts on the matter. I will offer that I am a talker, and so it might be best to pause on questions until the end, if possible, just because I have a lot of information and a lot of words behind that information. And so we'll jump in today, and we'll kind of do this journey together. So let's start with talking about what is sensory processing. So this is just the basics of sensory processing. Sensory processing as a whole is a very complicated neurological system. However, when we're looking at just the basics of what sensory processing is, we're actually going to start with the fact that it starts at a sensory receptor. And so whether that is your eye, whether that is the sensory tactile receptors of your skin, whether it is the sensory receptors within your muscles and your joints, it's going to start, external world is going to somehow impact your sensory system through those sensory receptors. So my example here, let's say that you're out walking your dog. All right. If you don't have a dog, that makes it a little awkward. I'm not sure where you got a dog, but you have a dog right now. You're out walking your dog. All right. And you're at a crosswalk. And at that crosswalk, you're experiencing a lot of sensory information, because at that crosswalk, you have the walk sign, you have the actual crosswalk itself, and then you also have some traffic at that crosswalk. All of these things are going to be coming at your sensory system. And for the most part, they're going to be coming through your eye. Yes, it's also coming through your ear, some tactile, all of that. But right now we're going to look at the eye. So your eye is taking in all this sensory information. Your eye is then sending that sensory information into your brain. And it's going into your brain through the limbic system. And that's going to be relevant as we talk a little bit later about trauma. But remember that it's going to go into your brain and it's going to be processed in your limbic system through the amygdala and some other areas of the brain. And depending on what the sensory information is, specifically, it's going to go to different parts and be processed in different parts of your brain. But your brain then is going to do some analysis of it and figure out what behavior motor response is needed based on the sensory information of your environment. And so you have the visual information of the walk sign, you have the visual information of the crosswalk, and you and your dog are waiting to cross. But let's say that you have the visual information of a car also coming. Your brain is going to see that visual information through its eyeball. It's going to process that information in the limbic system in the brain, and then it's actually going to direct you to a motor or behavioral response of waiting to cross the street with your dog until that car is passed, or noticing how the car is slowing and it's safe for you to pass. So that's the basics of sensory processing. What you're actually thinking of within this is there's these different steps that occupational therapists are paying attention to. We're paying attention to how well your body actually gathers information from our senses. Perhaps you have a visual acuity difference, and your eyeball gathers information about the visual information of the world differently than other people's eyeballs, or perhaps it doesn't gather it at all. And so there could be a difference in how you're actually gathering information from your senses. There could also be a difference in how you're filtering information to identify which pieces are pertinent or important. Is it important that the trees are green in that picture that we looked at? No, but it is something that your eyeball could take in. But your brain is probably not going to be focused on that when you're looking at the walk sign and the car that's coming. Okay. And so your brain is in charge of filtering the information to identify the relevant pieces. Some brains are going to do this differently, and our past experiences are going to impact what information our brain identifies as important. And so there could be a difference in how you're doing that. It could also just be that your environment has demanded you to pay attention to different things. And if you're in a new environment, you might pay attention to different things than if you would in a different environment. There's also a possibility that you could have differences in how you process the information to know the appropriate response for the demands of the environment. And so as you're processing this information, you're layering it on top of your understanding of appropriate responses. And sometimes our brains are going to process that information differently than other people around us. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it can have a difference. So for example, you're able to see the car, see the walk sign, and you're able to process that information to know, is it safe to cross or not safe to cross? I'm sure we've all made missteps sometimes, misjudged whether we should respond in a certain way, and then either been startled by the response of the environment to our interaction, or just recognized, oh, I did not take in that information and respond in the best way possible. And then finally, that producing the appropriate behavioral and motor piece is actually its own skill as well. So even sometimes our brains will give us the right response, and our bodies will actually produce a response different than what our brain's telling it to. So for example, maybe your brain is saying, yeah, it's safe to cross, and maybe you stumble as you step off the curb. Okay, so maybe your body's having a different response than what your brain is telling it to do. Okay, and so there could be that difference as well. Now, one of the key things to think about with sensory processing is that all of those behavioral responses, those are the observations that we can see related to how the sensory processing system is working for an individual. But those are behavioral responses. And those responses, and to clarify what I mean, in occupational therapy, I'm not looking at behavior meaning the response to an antecedent, anything like that. I just mean it is an outward response of the body to the sensory information. And so we're able to observe those responses, but we're not necessarily looking at the actual internal processing for individuals. Everyone has unique sensory processing response patterns. And in occupational therapy, we tend to clump them into 4 categories based on a model by Winnie Dunn, the sensory processing model. And so these are the 4 categories that Winnie Dunn speaks to. And with those are going to be how we process or how we categorize those sensory processing response patterns. Now, I have a little challenge for everyone. If you're able to access your chat and want to do this, I would love to see a list of the 8 most recognized types of sensory input. So I'll give you one as a gimme because we've been talking about it, and that would be visual. Okay. What are the other 7? If you want to type into the chat, you can type just one. Just give me one of them. All right. But what are some of those sensory response types? We're going to see if we can get all 8 as a group. All right. Let's see. Okay. I see tactile. That's going to be touch. I see smell. I see auditory, which is sound. I see olfactory, which is smell. I actually see vestibular, which makes me very happy. And I see interoception, which has my heart. Let's see. Did I see proprioceptive? Yes, I see proprioceptive as well. Folks, you all are rock stars. We got all 8. Nice job. So for those of you that are trying to catch up a little bit on what all those 8 are, I'm going to touch on them very briefly. So we got the 5 basics, which we all learn in kindergarten: the sight, smell, touch, taste, and sound. I always have trouble with the main 5. I don't know why. All right, so we got those main 5, those kindergarten senses, right? The additional 3 that might be new for some of you, but I'm so impressed that some of your colleagues have identified, is going to be proprioception. Proprioception is basically our body's ability to get information about the position of our joints and our muscles. Okay. So proprioception uses sensors within the joints and the muscles to give us information about what our body is actually doing. All right. So sometimes we'll hear this referred to as like the positional sense. And that's because right now, without looking, you can probably tell if your toe is pointed up to the sky, is flat on the ground, or is pointed down to the ground. And that's all because of that sensory information from the joint of your ankle. All right. It sends information about the position of your body. And so that can be your proprioception. But this is also a very important sense in the sense that it gives you information about how much you are using your muscles. So have you ever gone to pick up a can of soda off a table and you pick it up and it's empty and that surprises you and you just go, whoa, and like almost throw the can? All right. So that is actually, you got information from your environment about that can. You made an assumption in your brain and you recruited enough muscles to pick up a full can of soda, but that can was empty. And so your ability to gauge that amount of force is proprioception ability. That is, if you think back to that chart of where the different skills come in, that is your ability to kind of grade that motion to an appropriate response. And in that case, you failed, but it's not your fault. You didn't have all the information in the soda. All right. And so proprioception is our body's ability to make plans for, it's our ability to sense how much muscle force we need, what position our joint should be in, things like jumping, that impact of the foot on the floor, that sends a proprioceptive signal. Things like crossing your legs. I'm actually I'm trying to behave myself a little bit and act like a professional today. So you don't see my knee in the screen because I tend to be somebody who sits with like my knee up next to my ear a lot. And that is because I really enjoy proprioceptive sensation in my body. And so I like that sensation in my joints. And everyone has different sensation with that. So that's proprioception. Vestibular is going to be our movement sensation. And sometimes you'll hear this referred to as movement through space, which is accurate. It does help you to know kind of how close things are. But what I will offer is that it's actually sensation of the inner ear. And what it's actually telling you is the position of your head. So it's actually telling you, is your head tilted? Is your head back? And it's actually integrating it with your vision to help you to know balance and speed, velocity. All right. And so it's the fluid in your inner ear as you're bending forward. It's helping it's giving the sensation of the hairs moving in your inner ear and the fluid with that. Almost like a level, if you've ever used a level and the little bubble like moves around, you can think of it kind of like that. All right. So it's letting you know that piece of it. You might see this one as when somebody's on a roller coaster. You might, and the reason that we get that drop in our stomach is because our bodies are still, but everything is moving past us really fast. And so that is our inner ear is like, what the heck are you doing? Your visual information and like the body position is going way too fast, like the speed's way too fast for the amount of movement your body's actually doing. Same with car sickness, the vestibular thing. Okay. You might also see this. Well, I'm not going to give away that one because that one I'm going to use later. But this is also, don't forget, it's that head position. So you might see people that are very uncomfortable being upside down or people that love being upside down. Same kind of thing. All right. And then the third sensation that you might have heard was interoception. And interoception is the sensation inside our organs. And so this is going to control things like how much you feel your stomach digesting. Some people really can pay attention to that thing, especially people that have like IBS or other things that make their stomachs and their intestines a little more sensitive to that sensation, can really tell like where the food is that they're digesting. I do not have that. I am very low registration in that sense, but I can tell when my heart rate is raising and I can tell when my blood pressure is raising. I'm very sensitive to those. And so this can also be telling when you need to use the restroom. It can be just having an internal pain or awareness of what your organs are doing, that sort of thing. So that's interoception. And so those are going to be the big 8. All right. And there's others that we just don't talk about quite as much. Those are the main ones. Now, how people respond to these sensations, that is where I want to really talk today. And that is the emphasis of everyone has unique processing response patterns. The four patterns that Winnie Dunn has occupational therapists put them in are low registration, sensitivity, seeking, and avoidance. Low registration is that you don't have awareness of the sensations as much as other people. So basically, I like to think of it as, if you're on a tennis court and you're throwing tennis balls over to the other side, if the net's really high, it's hard to get those tennis balls to the other side. And so the person on the other side of the net doesn't receive as many of those inputs. Okay. They don't receive as many balls coming over to their side of the court because they're just not going over the net. And the same kind of thing, you have a really high threshold for what alerts the brain that there's sensation there. So low registration might be something like, you have a child who is paying attention to something that they're doing, and you go in and you say their name, and you're like, so and so, time to clean up, and they just keep on playing, and you're like, so and so, time to clean up, just keep on playing, and then eventually you go over and you like tap them on their shoulder, and maybe they jump a little bit, and now all of a sudden, because you did a different sensory input, now they're paying attention, and you're like, time to clean up, and they're like, what? Why didn't you tell me? Right? And that's going to be some low registration. They didn't register that you were saying their name for a while. Okay. This can be a pattern that can happen with all the senses. So my youngest kiddo, it is always a constant race to the bathroom for that kid. Fully toilet trained, but it is always a race to the bathroom. And he has very low registration with interoception. All right. He just doesn't get the information that his bladder is full until it is last minute. And so that's going to be a low registration thing. Low registration of tactile might be somebody who like leans on you without noticing. That person on the plane, right? They're always like right up against your arm, and you're like, how are you not aware? So we are touching and strangers, right? And so I think that might be a low registration. Okay, it could be other things too, but it might just be a low registration. All right. Seeking goes with low registration. So if low registration is just the missing of sensory information, so not alerting to information from your environment, seeking is your brain saying, I need more information and seeking it out. Okay. So with seeking, you're still missing information, but your brain is saying, hey, I don't have enough to know the appropriate response. Get me more. So seeking is going to be things like kiddos who come up and always want to touch or hug you. All right. It would be something like the kiddo who is in class and they are out of their seat every chance they get because they are wanting to walk around the room. Okay? So that would be seeking. Seeking can also be things like a kid that is flashing the lights or flushing the toilet repeatedly. Seeking in adults, because don't forget, adults also have these patterns, can be something like blasting music really loud. Okay, it can be eating constantly. Those sorts of things are seeking. All right, people who have candles on all the time, especially if it's to the point that other people might be like, oh, that's a little too much candle. That might be a seeking pattern. Okay. Sensitivity is the opposite of low registration. Sensitivity is where every single tennis ball is flying right at you. There's no barriers in the way. You are getting all the sensory input from the environment. Sensitivity might be like something where you just notice a lot of things or you're distracted by a lot of things, but basically you're alerting to the sensory input more than other people. Okay. Sensitivity might look like the kid who is trying to listen to the teacher's story, and every time somebody moves around in the room, they're looking at that person instead. It could be, my youngest also has some visual sensitivity, and he has the most beautiful brain. I always say sensitivity is also a superpower because he notices visual details that I would never notice. He is the kid that in the car, he's like, Mommy, do you see the beautiful sunset? And I'm like, I was just looking at traffic. I missed it completely. Thank you for pointing that out. He sees all these details. And so sensitivity is where you just notice a lot of the information in your sensory world. So that would be sensitivity. Avoidance would be where you're noticing so much information that your brain is like, okay, I need a break. I have too much. I need a break. I cannot process all of this. Okay. And so then avoidance is the behavior pattern of your brain needs a break from all the sensory information. And so you avoid it. Um, my little guy who has the visual sensitivity also has some avoidance patterns in that he likes to wear sunglasses when it's bright outside, or we kind of have to leave our lights off in the morning. He comes down and he does the cutest little groggy thing of like, Mommy, why is the light on? And I'm like, because I've been awake for an hour, child. And so he needs us to turn that off for a while, but that's an avoidance pattern. Okay. And so you can kind of see all four of these patterns. And hopefully, as you're sitting there listening, you can recognize these in yourself. You can recognize these in your significant other or your kids, because the truth is that we all have these patterns. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that within one individual, they may have different patterns for different sensations. All right. And so it is very common to be low registration for auditory and sensitive to visual, or it's very common to be seeking for proprioception and sensitive to vestibular. So you can have all of these different patterns at play. It's also very common to have different patterns for different types of input within a category of input or for different situations. So, for example, if you're low registration for auditory information, you miss auditory information, it might be that you just miss verbal auditory information, but maybe you're sensitive to musical auditory information. All right. And so these are just patterns, and these are not like brick wall patterns. They're not you are always this. This is a standard. You don't cross the plane. It's a very fluid thing. But what we're looking at is that we do identify that there is kind of this opportunity for a shift in there. Okay. All right. So those are going to be the four patterns that we're going to look at. Now, how do we support response patterns? And again, this is for everyone. And one of the things I want to emphasize is remember that that sensory needs and sensory responses can vary across individuals. And so when I say this is how you support these response patterns, I want you to know these are generalizations, these are guidelines, these are where I would start my problem solving. And so these are not meant to be, hey, if this, then this, and it's a constant promise of always going to work. A lot of times it requires a lot of problem solving. The other thing I want to mention is, when do we provide support for response patterns? I've already said that everyone has different response patterns, and it's really important that we don't pathologize sensory processing pattern differences when they're not causing problems. I'll share this. During the pandemic, I had my kids home with me full time, and I was also at that time a full-time faculty member of occupational therapy, and so I was teaching full time. And it became very clear very fast that my daughter and I had sensory processing pattern conflicts. I am very sensitive to auditory information. I am easily distracted by auditory information. And my daughter is auditory seeking, which I didn't realize until we were trying to do Zoom calls in the same room. But my daughter would sit at her lesson, at her Zoom, and I realized she would sit there on mute to everyone else but me because I was in the room with her. And she would make all sorts of mouth sounds. It was just a constant like, or like, like it was constant, just always making sounds with her mouth. And I was constantly distracted. But I want to be clear, a lot of times I think that we would hear about this interaction and it would be, oh, wow, she has auditory seeking and we need to fix that. And that's not accurate because that doesn't own our own patterns and how the interaction of those patterns is impacting us. All right. And so it is definitely not that there was a problem with, sorry, my dog, see, and I'm auditorily distracted. My dog has his squishy toy. Um, but um, but it's not a problem with the patterns itself. It is it's when those patterns either create so much conflict that it can't be resolved, or that it keeps the child from being able to interact in an environment in a meaningful way for them. And so it would be, I'll give you this other example. I have a little bit of sensory sensitivity to tactile information, specifically to the sensation of wet hair on my hand. All right. Now, that sensation of wet hair on my hand, I don't like it. Talking about it now, I actually feel a little queasy. However, I I still shower. I just want to reassure you all. I do still shower and I do still wash my hair. But my coping strategy is to have a towel in my bathroom so that I can wipe my hand if I get hair on my hand. All right. It has not kept me from functioning and doing the activities that I need to do despite this pattern. And so it would be wrong to say, oh, you have tactile sensitivity. We need to fix that in you. When we're looking at these patterns, a lot of times it's that we need to adjust the environment so that it matches the pattern and allows for meaningful engagement of the individual. And so as we're talking, occupational therapists, we're not trying to change the patterns of the individuals or the children. We all have different patterns. It's kind of what makes us unique and endearing, all right? But what we're trying to do is create an environment that supports those patterns in helping the child to reach their goals or their successes. And so if you have a child who with low registration, where the low registration is significantly impacting their ability to do the activities that are important to them. So if they have low registration, that's maybe they're unsafe because they miss cues in the environment, or maybe it makes transitions for them really hard because the transitions seem to surprise them, those sorts of things. Well, then this is how you would support them. So with low registration, you would increase the input. So a kid's missing you saying their name, you're going to say their name louder. All right. That would be increase the input. You can change the type of input. Kids missing you saying their name, touch them on the shoulder. You now have gone from auditory to tactile. All right. Kids missing their name and it's causing problems with transition, we're going to give concrete cues. So remember that with low registration, you're going to miss those cues from your environment. I often relate it to if you're driving down the highway and you missed your exit. Have you ever driven down the highway and you've been like so focused that you missed your exit, even though it's the exit you take every time, right? Okay, so you missed the exit, all right? If it would be that you missed all those cues that your exit was coming up, right? Exit's still there. Exit's the same place as it's always been. Same number of signs, right? Although sometimes we like to say like, oh, it's so dumb, I missed my exit. They must have taken away the sign, right? No, they didn't take away the sign. Like you just missed the sign, right? And so, but those concrete cues are basically putting up more signs that that something is present in the environment or that something is coming in the environment. So concrete cues. An example of this would be something like, oh, if you've ever been in a school and you've seen like the stop sign on the door, that's actually a really nice concrete cue that you're about to leave the classroom and go into the rest of the school. That can help with transition. So those concrete cues for transitions can be something really helpful for kids with low registration. If kids have seeking patterns, then you're going to actually set a schedule for input. And so These are the kids that are always seeking more information. And one of the best things you can do is have a set schedule of when they will get that information, because then their brain can trust that it will get the information it needs eventually and at a specific time. And so instead of their brain saying, hey, I need this information right this second, I need it now, at a time where possibly it's interfering with the child's ability to have a meaningful engagement. If you have a set schedule for when they will get that input, their brain can kind of relax a little bit and be like, I'll get what I need when I get it, and it just kind of helps them to feel more secure. And then another thing with seeking is you can, again, increase the input. So if you have a kid that is touching everything, or if you have a kid that is, flushing the toilet to hear that toilet sound, you can increase the input that they get so their brain has enough of it. You can give them something to rub if they need the tactile. You can record a toilet flush and just play it on repeat for them if they need it. And I haven't done that one actually, I just want to say, but I would if a kid needed it. And you can increase the input so that their brain is getting enough information to know how to respond in the environment. All right. Sensitivity. If you have a child who is sensitive to different sensory information, maybe they're a kid that never wants to do messy play or something like that. And remember, it's okay for them to not want to do messy play. We only care about it if it's actually interfering with something that they want to do. All right, that they would be meaningful or a safety thing for them. Okay, and so, but if it is interfering, you can give them choices. So let's say they really want to go to this birthday party, but it's a painting party and they have sensitivity where, or even avoidance, where they don't want to be around paint, or they're just really antsy if they're around paint. You can give them choices. Maybe they can go, but they can wear gloves. All right. Choices and control are going to help with sensitivity. So giving them those choices is really important. Or you can decrease the input. So maybe you give them just like a tiny bit of paint instead of a lot of paint that all the other kids are getting. All right. So anytime you can give choices and control or decrease the input, that's good for sensitivity and avoidance. And then the other one for avoidance is you can prepare them for the input. This helps with sensitivity too, actually. But the thing I would offer is a lot of times we don't always prepare kids for the sensations that they're going to experience. But if we can prepare them for that input, their brains will know what to expect, and it will help them to identify if it's in line with what's expected or not. And so I saw a really great thing one time. It's a social story that was used for barbershops. And it talked to the kids about what to expect at the barbershop. And I actually used it for my own kids when I took them to the barbershop, because I have two kids that have some auditory sensitivity and avoidance patterns. And I was like, they're going to get in that chair. They're going to get the razor next to their head. And all of a sudden they're going to be out of that chair and out of the barbershop. And so I prepared them for it. I also prepared the barber for their possible responses. And so luckily I have an amazing barber who I would recommend for anyone if they're looking for a good barber for kids with sensitivity in St. Louis. But I prepared the environment and I prepared them for the input that they would receive. And so those are going to be kind of the main patterns. But now we're going to practice a little bit. So I have four prompts up here. We're going to do one at a time. You can put your answer into the chat. All right. But we're going to name the pattern. And so when you're naming a pattern, what you want to do is you want to name the sensory input type. So auditory, tactile, you want to name the sensory input type, and then the pattern of response that you're observing. Okay. So number one, child A is always touching things they shouldn't be, especially when they go into a new home, classroom, or store. I don't know if you've met this child in your work, the one that comes into the office and touches every little thing around the table. All right. But what pattern might we see with that? Yes, I'm seeing lots of tactile seeking, and that is correct. Great job. Perfect. Okay. And if I saw that pattern, I would respond by giving them more input So maybe if I know that this is something they do, maybe I give them like a little worry rock that they can rub in their pocket, or maybe I give them some parameters and say, hey, when you get in, you can touch these two things. All right. So maybe I give them a few parameters. All right. But don't forget, does it hurt them to touch anything? Well, I guess it depends on what they're going into. If they're going to like a factory, yeah, probably. Also, why are you taking them to a factory? But, just think about, is it a safety thing? Is it really a problem? But if for some reason it is, then give them other things that they can do. Okay. All right. Child B is easily distracted from their homework by anyone entering the room or any artwork on the wall. It takes so much effort to keep them focused. What pattern are we seeing? Easily distracted by anyone entering the room or artwork on the wall. Yes, sensitivity visual. Awesome job. You all, I hope you're learning and didn't just come in with all this knowledge, because you're doing great. All right. So, yes, visual sensitivity, absolutely. And so with that, I would limit the input. And so maybe this kid, when we're doing homework, maybe I make sure they're set up in a pretty neutral environment with very little visual input to distract them. I would kind of limit it in that. Okay. All right. And then number 3, I have child B again. I don't know. Maybe they made a second appearance, apparently. Child B also throws a fit whenever it's time to clean up, despite you verbally announcing the 5-minute, 3-minute, and 1-minute countdown. They seem surprised and angry when you tap them on the shoulder and say the activity is over. What do you think? For number 3, what pattern might that be? Yep, I'm seeing some low registration auditory. Good, excellent. Yeah, so I would say low registration auditory, and the reason, because this one is a little bit trickier. The reason is because you're doing the verbal announcing, and that's what they're missing. So that's why I would say low registration auditory. I would say it could be low registration tactile if you had tapped them multiple times and they'd missed that information. But since it seemed like the first time you tapped them, they're like, ooh, and surprised, then I would say that. So what I would do for that, I might change the input. So maybe we flash the lights to indicate that it's about time to transition. Visual timers might be good, that sort of thing. Okay. And then child D, number 4, refuses to flush the toilet and runs away if someone else flushes. What pattern are we seeing in child D? Yes, auditory avoidance. Yes, probably some auditory sensitivity as well, but I think the main thing is that avoidance, because they're leaving the room when it happens. Absolutely. And so for this one, there's a few things that I could do depending on the situation. You can always use like headphones so that it's not as loud. You want to try to prepare them. I would probably do a social story about what to expect when they're in the bathroom, that sort of thing. And then if I'm in a therapeutic setting and I'm trying to build the relationship, I might have them step outside the room and have me flush it as a weird way to show that I'm like taking care of them until that rapport, that relationship, and that trust is built up. And so, yeah, so those would be the patterns that I see there. Great job, team. All right. So that was all just talking about sensory patterns for typical population. Now let's layer in the complex trauma piece. Okay. So if there's any neuroscientists on the call, I'm going to apologize now because I have greatly simplified the stress response in the brain. I'm sure it's really stressful for you that I did that. Apologies. So this is a very simplified version of the stress response in the brain. Okay, so this is going to be the SAM pathway and the HPA axis in case you're a neuroscience person who really is wanting to know. But so basically, what we're looking at, the reason that sensory and stress are related is because most of the time stress is going to be triggered by sensory input. Okay, so we have the sensory input in the environment. For example, if you see a dinosaur, and then it's going to go into the sensory system, just like we talked about earlier, and it's going to be filtered through the limbic system, which is going to produce fight, flight, freeze response, okay, in a stressful situation where there's a threat perceived. When this happens repeatedly, it actually creates pathways in the brain that are attuned for stress. And so it's going to actually create those pathways. As you all know, as people who do work with kids who've experienced trauma, right? It's actually going to change the way that they start interpreting that sensory input. So remember how we talked about the fact that there were those different skills in how the sensory input is actually processed? Well, the stress and chronic traumatic stress, developmental trauma, those aren't necessarily going to change how the eyeballs take in the information from the environment, but it will take in what information the child is alerted to as they are watching for threats. It will also take in and process differently how the child interprets the threat level of the sensory information. And it will change how they actually respond to the threat in their environment. Okay, so we need to be aware that sensory is a key piece of that. So sensory is going to be that sensory input, and that initial sensory processing is what is going to kind of start that stress response. If that has happened repeatedly during brain development, these are the things that we're going to notice. So we're going to see a hypervigilance. So if you're familiar with Porges and polyvagal theory, the way that we would kind of speak to that is we would say that there's a trauma-aligned neuroception that's going to happen. And so that the way that we are always constantly scanning our environment for potential threats, that neuroception piece is going to be trauma-aligned. And so, the way that I always speak to this is if you had threats in your environment that were real threats in your environment, you are going to be watching for those threats in future environments, and you're going to be hyper vigilant for those threats. The challenge with that, because that is a wonderful survival skill that human brains have developed, the challenge with that is that that means that you are hyper alert to threats and you miss other cues in your environment. Okay, so if you are hyper alert to the walk sign, you might miss the car coming down the street. All right. If you are hyper alert to the cars, you might miss the social interaction happening next to you. Okay. You have probably had this happen in your life in certain ways, kind of regardless of your background, because a few years ago, my wife is a bicyclist, and bicycles everywhere. And unfortunately, a few years ago, she was hit by a car. And ever since then, she has been so focused on cars while she's riding her bicycle. It really changes how she, interacts with other people while she's riding. It really changes with how she interacts with other environmental aspects while she's riding. And it's that hypervigilance related to trauma. And when those kinds of traumas happen during brain development, it is not just that you have this one trigger for yourself, it is that your entire sensory processing system is now aligned for survival and trauma, right? And so, we'll talk about the fact that kids who've experienced trauma might have low registration for verbal auditory information because they are so hypersensitive to smells of alcohol or to body language of individuals. And so that's really a big piece of what we're seeing is that hypervigilance, that hyper alert to threat. We're also going to see those structural changes in the brain, in the brain structures, and specifically in the limbic system. Now, remember, I've mentioned the limbic system a few times in this presentation, and I've mentioned it referring to two different systems. I've mentioned it referring to the sensory processing system and to the emotional regulation system of stress. Because they are so closely intertwined, and this is what I failed to know as an occupational therapist before I did receive trauma training, is those are so closely aligned that we really can't pull them apart. And so I know that my whole premise of this presentation was, is it sensory related? And the truth of the matter is, yes. People always ask me, is it sensory or behavior? And I wondered for so many years why I struggled with that answer. And it's because you can't answer that. They are so closely aligned, so intertwined that it really, I'm sure a neuroscientist could probably pull them apart for us, but I don't know that it would give us a functional opportunity or a clinical opportunity if they did, because they are so closely aligned that it is genuinely, they go hand in hand, and you can't pull them apart. And so with the structural changes in the brain that we see with developmental trauma, the increase in the amygdala and decrease in the hippocampus, with the strong tie to sensory processing and safety, it's even stronger with trauma. When that stress response is activated routinely during brain development, that means that their sensory system is also activated routinely toward threat. And so those structural changes in the brain are going to also change how they process sensory information. And one of the things that's so interesting is, we do a sensory profile assessment on all of the kids that come through, and I have a love-hate relationship with the sensory process or the sensory profile. And my love-hate relationship is because I love that the sensory profile gives me an opening and an opportunity to start talking with caregivers about sensory and how the behaviors and the choices that they see kids making are really just responses to sensory input, and different response patterns. And I love the opening. And if you are not doing the sensory profile with clients or with the kids you're working with, I do think it's an awesome opportunity to start those conversations and help caregivers to see those differences and how they're playing out in interactions. But one of the beefs that I have with the sensory profile is that that it is so not validated on kids who've experienced trauma that almost every area comes up as significantly different for kids who've experienced trauma, because their actual structural changes to their brain and their sensory patterns are so intertwined with their emotional regulation, and are so sensitized to trauma that that the sensory profile is not quite sensitive enough to pick up on those specific differences. I have other beefs with it too, but I think that it's a great tool to start with if you're looking for something to just start these conversations at your organization, and you don't have to be an occupational therapist to use it. So, but the other thing to be aware of is that the near constant fight, flight, freeze, the other sensory piece that's really important is the interoception impact. So, this is something that I didn't talk about as much before I started working with kids who've experienced trauma, but there are differences in interoception related to that near constant fight, flight, freeze. So when our fight, flight, freeze systems are activated, it changes the hormones in our body so that our muscles become flooded with blood, our heart rate increases, our blood sugars change, our respiratory rate increases, right? All of these things, and our immune system goes down while our response to like physical trauma goes up, right? And so we do see when kids have had that fight, flight, freeze response activated routinely during development, we see differences in their perception of those internal sensations. And a lot of times there's a close tie between stress and pain and these interoception sensations in kids who experience trauma. So, we get a lot of tummy aches, a lot of headaches, just very sensitive to those interoceptive pieces. Okay. All right. So what do we do with this information? Now that we know that sensory and trauma is very closely tied, we need to be sure that we're speaking to the fact that it's not about being safe. It's not about whether we are keeping kids safe. It is about whether or not we are helping kids to feel safe. And when we're looking at these contributors to feeling safe, I think that there's a lot that goes into it, but these are the kind of the main building blocks that go into that feeling safe. And that's going to be their past experiences. They're going to shape how they feel safe in an environment. Different identity factors will help people to feel safe or help them to identify potential threats in their environment. And those past experiences shape that feeling of safety. Histories of trauma will shape their experience of safety in different environments. The other things are a sense of connectedness, the social equity or the power dynamics, the caregiver attunement response, and then the sensory environment is a big piece of it too. Now, I wish that I'm not going to say I wish I was more tech savvy, because let's be real, it's that I haven't put the time into doing this. I wish I had the time to put in to making this visual one where the size of the blocks change, because it changes for different people. For some kids, that sensory environment is going to be huge. It's going to be the whole top row there. For some, it's going to be a little bit smaller. And it depends kind of on the past experiences and the relationships that supported kids through their past experiences as to what piece of these things is going to be bigger and more impactful for their ability to feel safe. But regardless, we want to try to create the best chance at feeling safe in an environment. And so we're really going to look at the sensory environment as a piece of that. And so now we're into the question of how do we support children with trauma histories to feel safe in the sensory world? So this slide really gives you kind of the key takeaways to remember in addressing sensory and trauma. The first one is don't work to change the child, change the environment. All right. And so while I'm an occupational therapist that is working with kids who've experienced trauma, I am not working to change their sensory processing patterns. What I am doing is working with them and their caregivers to be able to advocate for environmental changes so that they can feel as safe as possible in their sensory environments. And so that is a really crucial thing that I think is very important, just in creating that felt safety. And so, if I have a child who does not feel safe in environments where there's a lot of loud noise, I'm not going to, sit with that child in loud environments and be like, do you feel safe yet? I'm going to try to change that environment and turn down the noise for them. Whether that is helping the caregiver to learn how to respond to the caregiver's own dysregulation by maintaining a quiet voice, whether that is giving the child headphones. I will say there is no evidence out there that we are able to actually change sensory processing systems. We are only able to provide coping strategies and self-advocacy strategies to change the environment to be what they need so that they can perform and function in an environment. We can give input throughout the day, and that's really important. And that's changing routines is also a piece of changing that environment for them. And as I'm saying that, we really need to treat sensory as a basic need. So our brains cannot focus on what we want them to focus on until our sensory needs have been met. And that's really crucial to understand. And so recognizing that sensory is a basic need. I always talk about this, and I'm going to kind of clump it with the next one too, which is regulate before you need it, right? So I don't know if any of you have ever had toddlers in your life, but let's pretend that we're all going on a road trip and we're all taking a toddler with us. Again, kind of like the dog, if you don't have a toddler, it's more awkward. I'm not sure where you got the toddler, but you're taking a toddler with you on this road trip, okay? And so you're going on this road trip. Let's say that we're going, somewhere in the state. It's going to be like 4 or 6 hours, somewhere like that. But unfortunately, for some weird reason, there are no restaurants along the way. None. There's just no restaurants along the way. You can type into the chat, what are you going to do for this toddler? Taking them on a 4 or 6 hour road trip. No restaurants. None at all. What are we going to do? You're going to pack snacks, right? Let's be real. If you've had a toddler on a road trip before, you're bringing snacks regardless of the restaurants along the way, right? Absolutely. Okay, you're packing snacks, all the snacks. I love that one. Yes, all of the snacks. Bringing all of the snacks, right? Okay. I want you to do the same thing with sensory. Okay. If you know you have an expectation of a child to be in an environment where their sensory needs won't be met for a little bit, or you're asking them to be regulated emotionally or sensory wise in an environment, pack the snacks. Make sure that you give the child the basic need of sensory input that they need before you're asking them to sit quietly in a car for 4 to 6 hours, before you're asking them to participate in circle time, before you're asking them to participate in a therapy session that is really emotionally uncomfortable for them, right? Provide the sensory input before it's needed. It's so interesting to me that we have kids in school, and I think most teachers now are very good at recognizing you don't ask a child to perform at school and take tests and do things if they haven't had breakfast, right? I think teachers have gotten much better at this. You wouldn't say, oh, there's a child that's hungry, why are they throwing a fit? But I really would love to see a day where teachers don't expect kids to perform on tests or in environments before their sensory needs have been met, right? I would love to see, us start to say as a society, oh, this child has been asked to sit still without movement for 6 hours. It makes sense they're throwing a fit. Okay. And so those are going to be really important things, is treating sensory like a basic need. The other thing is, don't treat it as a reward or punishment. Okay. Because you wouldn't use, okay, I say this as a mother who's very guilty of using food as a reward, like candy and stuff as a reward. But I would never, and hopefully you all wouldn't either, ever be like, if you don't do this, you don't get dinner, right? And so same kind of thing of, you wouldn't say, listen, if you don't do what I expect you to do, you don't get your weighted blanket. You don't get your movement break. Okay. Same kind of thing. Okay. So treat it as a basic need, regulate before you need it. It's not reward punishment. Okay. The last two here are very specific for trauma, but they are very important for everyone. And that is, anticipation is your ability to feel secure, and control is your ability to feel safe. Okay. And so this is probably something that you all are already familiar with, but let's think about it this way. Let's say that we're all going to go out to eat after this, which is very nice of you all to go out to eat with me. I appreciate it. We're all going to go out to eat at a restaurant that we've never been to. Okay. We've never been to this restaurant, but we're all going to go out to eat there. Put into the chat, what's the first thing you're going to do? First thing you're going to do. Yep, you're going to look at the menu, check the menu. Yep, need to know the menu. Yeah, absolutely. How many of you are Googling the menu right now if I announce that we're going to go out? Yep, okay. Yes, absolutely. Why do we do this? Because being able to anticipate what we're going to experience gives us a sense of security. Okay. This is especially true for those of us that have dietary needs or preferences, right? Same thing for kids. If a child has a specific need for security because their brain is very aware of threats, is very aware of trauma, they then have a specific need to be able to anticipate the sensory environment they're going into. How do we provide anticipation? Well, we can prepare them. We can do social stories. We can, drive to the environment they're going to be asked to perform in and let them explore it before they're asked to perform, prepare them in that way. We can also we can also let them anticipate by having a routine, having it be something that they can expect, having it be consistent. That allows them to anticipate. Finally, we're going to give them control. Okay. And so control is really going to look like, how much choice do they have? I had a foster teenager actually in my home for a few years, and he had to go to court mandated therapy, which I still have to wrap my head around that concept sometimes. But he had to go to court mandated therapy, and he hated this therapy. Not because of the therapist. Therapist was amazing. Loved her. But he would fight me on getting in the car, on going to court mandated therapy, until one day where I accidentally did something. I asked him to turn on my radio, and he was actually trying to be a little stinker, and put on his music instead of my music. But you know what? I let him do it. And we listened to his music the whole way. And he made super fun of me when I tried to dance to it. But you know what? His therapist told me after that session that he was like a different kid. And I don't know that it was only because of that. Maybe he was having a good day, But I do know that in that moment, he felt control in a situation where he had no control otherwise. And I think that the more we can give kids a sense of control over their environment, over the sensory information they're going to receive, I think that that will give them that sense of safety that is hard to get from environments where they have very little control. Why do we always say that sensory is a kid issue? How many of you, I mean, it's probably rare that you even talk about sensory processing with adults, right? Unless you're like super into this world. I talk about it all the time with my wife. But you know, I think that for the most part, we talk about kids. Why does it seem like such a kid issue in our society? Well, the main reason is because kids don't have the same control over their sensory environments that we do, right? Um, Probably very few of you got dressed today and put on clothes that make your skin crawl. Probably very few of you had dinner last night and it was something you absolutely hate to eat, that you don't like the feeling of in your mouth, right? Why is that? Because we're adults and so we have more control. It's not that kids are the ones with sensory issues and adults aren't. It's that adults get to choose the sensory environments they're in. I don't like loud, chaotic, noisy places, and so I don't tend to go to clubs, right? And that does not interfere with me. But you know where my kids don't get a choice of going? The cafeteria, right? And have you been in a cafeteria to school? That is not a great sensory environment to eat and rest and digest in. I just want to offer that. All right. And so it's very important that we acknowledge that that control is a big piece of safety for kids. All right. So where does this leave us? So um, I trust that all of you can provide those pieces of information for your clients, for the kids you're working with, for kids in your life in general. But when do we recommend occupational therapy? Well, I would just recommend occupational therapy when a child or a family is unable to participate in important activities in the way that they wish because of sensory processing. So I'll give you a very tangible example. I had a little girl I was working with who really wanted to play soccer so badly. She could not stand the sensation of inseams in pants. So she only wore skirts. And her school district said, I'm sorry, you can't play soccer in a skirt. You have to play in pants. And so that was a good opportunity that was the time that she was unable to participate because of her sensory processing. And so we were able to kind of problem solve with her. And also reached out to the school and just gave them some information about sensory processing differences. And so if you're unable to participate in important activities, the things that we see a lot in our clinic at Family Forward is a lot of kids who are too afraid to use restrooms because of the sound. We see kids who don't brush their teeth because of the sensation of toothpaste. Kids who won't take showers because they don't like the feeling of the shower. And we work with them. And remember, a lot of times trauma is very closely tied to sensory experiences. And so we have to work with both the emotional and the sensory regulation piece. And if you ever find that that sensory and emotional piece and that trauma piece is essential, I would try to seek out a trauma-informed occupational therapist. So if you're in St. Louis, we would love to see them come to Family Forward. If you're in other areas, I would have to Google and see who's out there because it is an emerging practice area. But I think that is an important piece. And I know there's a lot of great OTs out there doing great work, even in St. Louis that I just don't know about. And so, but I would say that's a good time. Another thing is if you ever need expert problem solving. And so some people's sensory patterns change so quickly that it's hard to track down those patterns. Sometimes the basic, hey, if you do this, this might work that I gave you earlier doesn't work. And so OTs are great at helping that problem solving. And then finally, when a child's sensory processing creates a barrier to their ability to process emotions therapeutically, that's the number one reason that we get referrals at Family Forward is kids who just aren't at a sensory regulation point where they can tolerate difficult conversations and be present in their bodies long enough for kind of the therapeutic opportunities that our therapists provide. And so that would be kind of one where we're able to support kind of the sensory processing. So that's when I would recommend occupational therapy. All right. So at this point, I want to make sure I've left time for questions, which is really rare for me, and I'm kind of proud of myself. I'm not gonna lie. I do want to just offer that again, you can email me with questions if you're uncomfortable sharing them in this forum. I will just mention I can't give specific consultation on specific children, but I can kind of tell you generally strategies and that kind of thing. And then this QR code here is actually a survey that I know that the hosts are hoping that you will fill out. And so please consider doing that. But in a second here, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can take any questions. I know there's a few already in the Q&A that I will address, but I wanted to leave the QR code up and my email up for just a few moments as we do that. So give me one moment and then I'll stop sharing and we can jump into some questions.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.
Would you like me to give you the questions?
I can read the questions if we want. Is avoidance similar to dissociating or going numb? This is a great question. So there is overlap in presentation. I would say that my understanding, and I am not going to claim any expertise in polyvagal theory. However, I would say that my understanding is that they are different sensory systems in the brain that I believe is the dorsal vagal nerve is the one responsible for a lot of dissociation, whereas avoidance is more in a different sensory tract, basically, of the brain. But I would say that there is a little bit of similarity in presentation. What I see with avoidance is more of avoiding specific sensory information, whereas when I see dissociation, I actually see almost like a separation from the present moment and like the entire sensory awareness, as opposed to kind of avoidance is more I don't like that touch, so I'm gonna not touch it, so there's some overlap. So are there other questions that I was meant to address?
The chat, Ashley, about any general tips if children don't like the feeling of the toothbrush or toothpaste.
Yeah, toothbrush, toothpaste. That's a very common one. So I would have to problem solve that and play with it just based on what the child doesn't like about it. I will say things that I have found that are helpful. One is sometimes either for or against electric toothbrushes. Sometimes the vibration of the electric toothbrush is better. Sometimes it is like way too much. Okay. And so I would say that one trial and error of those things. There's also some, if you've ever seen like infant toothbrushes that kind of like fit over your finger, sometimes those are nice because then the child has control over like how much pressure is being used and it's a little bit more they feel more control with it. The other thing I will say is sometimes different toothpaste flavors make a difference. And something, so it kind of fell into this one by fluke. My youngest didn't like toothpaste. And my wife is kind of an environmental nut and made us all switch over to like those toothpaste tabs that you chew and then brush. And for like he's great with that one. And so that's a new thing that I'm suggesting to people is if they don't like like the feeling of toothpaste, not just the taste, you might try the toothpaste like little tablets that you chew first and then brush. And so that'd be another one. And then the other thing with that is sometimes if you can set a timer or if you have a toothbrush with a timer so that they know when it's going to be over, that can be helpful. And then sometimes if you distract them, one thing I used with my kids when they were young is there's these like 2-minute podcasts out there. They're like toothbrushing podcasts. And if you can put that on, I wish I could remember the name. If anyone knows the name of the toothbrush podcast and can put in the chat, that'd be great. But there's like podcasts and stuff that you can kind of distract them with a little bit, and that can Any other questions I missed?
Were there any specific measures or tools that could be used for the sensory profile?
So the sensory profile is a tool. And so if you Google sensory profile, that is one that you can use. Again, I have some beefs with it, but I think it's a really good starting point. The other one OTs tend to use is the sensory processing measure. And I do like the sensory processing measure. The one thing I will say is I don't like the wording on the sensory processing measure because they describe it as like big difficulties or big like they kind of use dysfunction terms. So just be careful as you're explaining it that you're making sure not to pathologize it for caregivers, that you're actually saying, everyone has these differences. But I think that's a good one to start with too. And yeah, I think that both of those are really good. There's also some like free ones online that you can use if you're just using it for a conversation and not for like diagnostics or anything like that. So that's what I would offer. Okay. Anything else that I can answer for anyone or? Okay. Well, thank
I
you
will
all.
throw out a question, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
I was trying to find my mouse and I couldn't get it. I have the opportunity to work in a school district, and whenever you were using, specific examples for teachers and things, I thought, oh my gosh, because I don't know how they do this job. There's so many kids with so many different needs, and they are tired and they don't start every day with a clean slate with these kids. And it breaks my heart because they are just tired. Anyway, I guess I am thinking, what could you offer, or what, for a teacher who's struggling, what might you say? Because I feel like I'm constantly like cheerleading, like, do this, try this. I really want you to give this kid a chance. But, I have this many kids, and at one time, I'm the school based therapist, but they have 15 or 20 or 23 or whatever. And so I guess I'm looking for something that would help me help them, as far as like, I know this is hard work, but this child really needs XYZ, or, try these things. So just anything you have for that could help me support them.
I really love this question because I think it's really important for us to remember how challenging it is to help regulation in group environments, but also because I think that there's a lot to it. What I would offer is I think that the main thing I would say is there are things that can be done to provide sensory supports at a whole classroom level so that that takes some of the burden off of them. Um, because doing the individual sensory supports that occupational therapists provide is not tenable for a whole group situation like a classroom. But the things that they can do are things like a visual schedule for the entire class so that there is that anticipation piece. Um, there are opportunities to help kids to know what they will experience, and to give them some control as far as maybe they have choices of where they sit, or maybe they have choices of what sensations they'll experience. And so I would say that those things are some of the big ones. The other things are to just provide different opportunities for sensation within the classroom is a really big one. And so before kids are ever present, if there's an opportunity for kids to experience, quiet areas or louder areas, or, areas that are free of visual clutter, I would say the other thing I would offer too is that as much as teachers carry on them, and as much as amazing teachers are out there, they cannot provide sensory regulation without administrative support. And I think that that's a really big piece, is getting the administrators to understand the sensory processing needs of the kids and how much the teachers are shouldering in supporting them. And if you can get an administrator on board with allowing a teacher to create a safe sensory environment for their students, that's a big piece of it. When I worked in the school district, I know that there were certain mandates in some schools, like you have to have 2 pieces of student work for every student on the wall, and that just creates this chaos, and it takes it out of the teacher's hands to allow them to make those choices based on the individual needs of their students. And so I think that there's that piece. But those would be the big things: is how are they allowing kids to have choice? How are they allowing them to anticipate? And then I think too, just reassuring them that there are these sensory patterns, and so some of the things that they're probably perceiving as difficult or avoidance can look like refusal a lot of times, and it is not a personal affront to them. It is that the child just has these sensory needs and these sensory patterns, and if that cannot be offered as a reassurance to them, I think that's
something that my kids' school did that I thought was really neat. They asked all the parents, what do you think your child needs to do well? And that was when my son was in pre-K, but I think now if they ask the students, maybe second grade up, like, what do you feel like you need? Then, I mean, obviously the teacher can't do all of it, but the teacher could make an assessment of, calculating the data, like, okay, 7 out of 20 kids said this, so this might be nice to have a couple in the classroom, and they have a budget, so whatever. But having the kids identify what they believe they need, I think there's significance, and again, you're giving them that choice. And just a thought that popped in when Becky had asked that, I thought I'd share with the group.
I think that's a great thought. And honestly, I think that the other piece of it too is we as a society as a whole, parents, support workers, teachers, all of us, we really need to create a better culture that destigmatizes sensory needs. And I think that's really the biggest thing that a teacher can do is to really share the message of to their class of not everyone is going to need the same thing at the same time, and it is okay to provide those needs when they're needed. And I think the biggest opportunity that a teacher has is just to, kind of like what Maggie was just speaking to give those choices and to encourage the students to recognize that within the group environment, there are going to be different sensory needs, and that it's okay for kids to have different ways of meeting those needs. So to destigmatize the fact that maybe a kid needs to carry a wiggle seat with them into the assembly, to not make it that just the special education kids or just the kids in foster care need to have these accommodations, but that everyone needs them. That maybe you don't normally need it, but you didn't sleep well last night, and so you need that today. Like, I think giving everyone permission to meet their own needs when they have them, I think is one of the biggest things that teachers can do, and that we as a society can do, honestly, is just kind of allowing that to be the normalized and not stigmatized. So.
Well, please join me in thanking Ashley. This was fascinating and so very helpful. So we sincerely appreciate your time. We will not be hosting a speaker series in March due to so many people being in various spring break situations. In April, our Director of Services, Megan Marietta, will be presenting about suicide risk assessment. That will be a full 2-hour one that meets the state licensing requirements for suicide risk assessment. So thank you again, everyone. If you've been having issues with your certificate, you can go ahead and email us. Henley will include that. Oh, she already did. So again, thank you and take good care, and we'll look forward to seeing you hopefully in April. Bye.